Ladies and gentlemen, good evening once again. We'd like to begin. So, it's time now for the symposium. Oh, the names are all confused. This is not Professor Ulrich Becker. It's now time for a symposium. We have here 4 distinguished speakers who have all read the book, not in print, but before it was printed. And we'll discuss the book, and also, to the extent that this will come up, also in relation to the talk, although the explicit mission was here to open an Israeli discussion on a book in Hebrew in the presence of the author. I'll present the speakers one at a time as we go along. I thought of saying some introductory words about the book, but I think this won't be necessary since I think this will come up in the presentations. So let me start by presenting to you our first speaker for this symposium, Dr. Yishai Leblanc, a colleague here from the Faculty of Law. He studied here for his LLB, has a BA in philosophy as well, clerked for the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, Professor Aaron Barak. He then continued to study for his doctoral degree at Harvard University, returned to Israel to the faculty. He is also a member of the Youth Scholars in the Humanities and Social Sciences Forum of the Israeli Academy of Science. He has published on a variety of topics, but many of them touch upon the topic of cosmopolitanism. He's been interested in City and the World, which came out at Columbia Journal of Transnational Law, New Global Legal Order at Harvard Journal of International Law, and for our purposes, most significantly, he is the author of the now renowned introduction to the Ulrich Beck's book.
Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank both Shai and Joseph for giving me the honor and opportunity to think more and think through and with Professor Ulrich Beck's phenomenal, fascinating writing about cosmopolitanism. And while working on the introduction, of course, I already knew the work of Professor Beck, but it was a real joy to go back to some of the readings that I read as an undergrad and then as a graduate student, and to familiarize myself more with some of the less known writings of his. So I'm really thankful for the opportunity to do that. And I will actually give kind of a summation of my introduction, and that means that I will dedicate in length to actually presenting the work of Professor Beck, and also to give maybe a few comments and questions or critiques that I have had while reading it. So Beck's wonderful book is among the first to deal directly with the concept of cosmopolitanism in Hebrew. Liberal thinkers and international law theoreticians started to advance this idea in order to describe the direction in which the post-Second World War world order should progress. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, this line of thought became even stronger. In the view of these thinkers, the appearance of one transnational human community is an almost unavoidable logical deduction and philosophical unfolding of liberal humanism, which views the right-bearing individual as the core and purpose of all moral values. Communities, including national ones, and this is the most important one that Beck is dealing with, should take second priority, if at all, and withdraw when faced with the moral imperative to advance the dignity and equal liberty of each and every human individual. International law should reflect this understanding and abolish the preferential and unequal treatment that is the byproduct, or even the goal, of the national order and of the political theory of nationalism. Cosmopolitan liberals disagree among themselves on the theoretical and concrete consequences of cosmopolitanism. What moral obligations should stem from such global humanistic commitment? Should international legal norms be rigid or flexible in order to leave some room for existing cultures to express their competing views about what humanity is and what should it become? And what political institutions should exist in order to advance and protect this ideal? Thus, some support a world federation which, while committed to cosmopolitanism, would still protect some degree of community difference and particularity. Others try to advance a unitary world government. Cosmopolitanism has attracted critiques from left, right, and center. Communitarians, both liberal and non-liberal, Schmidt being a non-liberal one, Kimlicka and Walzer being liberals, have argued that it ignores the importance of communities and of collective identities in the life of individuals. Conservatives have decried cosmopolitanism as parasitical to urban lifestyle. Critics from the left also debunked it as a new imperialism, Western anthropocentrism, falsely masking itself as universal humanism. Beck rejects the regular meanings of cosmopolitanism, thus separating it from other concepts such as universalism, globalism, transnationalism, and internationalism. And here I want to make an observation that while Professor Beck gave his talk, he actually distinguished between cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitanization, which is a very interesting and novel distinction to me for Beck himself. That is, it is a distinction that I think is now being developed, which differentiates between supposedly the ideal, which is cosmopolitanism, and the process or the reality, which is cosmopolitanization. And I will later make a comment. I'm not sure that how to fit that within the greater scheme of Professor Beck, as I understand it. Anyway, Beck rejects the regular meanings of cosmopolitanism, thus separating it from other concepts such as universalism, globalism, transnationalism, and internationalism. For him, and this is his unique contribution to the debate, cosmopolitanism is an ideal and a reality. That is, it is the connection or the interconnectedness between the ideal and the process, between the ism and the zation of universalism, and it is a universalism that maintains a particularistic dimension of globality that includes nationalism within it, and of transnationalism which does not exclude a plurality of ethnicities and of cultures. Hence, the two immense contributions that Beck makes are as follows. First is the sociological shift. The question one needs to ask is what is cosmopolitanism rather than what cosmopolitanism should be. And second is the substantive shift that he makes. Cosmopolitanism, he claims, is not a universal antithesis to the various particulars, nationalism, localism, culturalism, and so forth, but is rather the synthesis, maybe it's the Hegelian synthesis, of previous theories. It is the overcoming of the dialectics between universalism and particularism, between internationalism and nationalism, and between globalization and localization. Cosmopolitanism is much more than a political theory, a philosophical utopia or dystopia for others, a governance program, a personal lifestyle, or a mental state of mind for Beck. It is the reality of our times. Beck turns the argument that cosmopolitanism is unrealistic ideology on its head, claiming that national theoreticians are the idealistic ones. They view reality with obsolete national lenses and thus cannot see the profound changes in reality which render their theory irrelevant and misguided. Cosmopolitanism is therefore a perspective, a political reality, and a normative theory all at once. And it is the critical theory of our times, and here it is important that it's a critical theory, since it challenges the most profound truths of our world, which we hold, and these are the national truths, therefore the national lies. The anti-national position of Beck is composed of a consequentialist argument and a methodological theoretical one. As a matter of consequence, he argues, nationalism has become regressive and anti-egalitarian. It hasn't always been like that. On the contrary, it might have been progressive and good and egalitarian at once, in the first modernity, perhaps, but currently it enables and reproduces global inequalities and justifies them by various means. This is also true for progressive nationalists, in particular perhaps, since the more they put effort into national egalitarian programs, the more they justify, even implicitly, but sometimes even explicitly, global inequalities. But the more radical critique of nationalism stems from Beck's methodological argument. Nationalism, and this is not just methodological, of course it is a theoretical argument. Nationalism is particularly toxic, not because of the overt justification it gives to national protectionism and global inequalities. This, of course, is the case often, but this is not the real toxicity of nationalism for Beck. It is dangerous due to its ideological and hegemonic status. Nationalism defines and ossifies our scientific and theoretical frameworks and our most basic categories of thought and knowledge. Nationalism as an ideology thus limits not only what we can imagine and wish for, but more importantly, what we already know and what we think reality is. Our data, statistics, categories, and concepts are all subject to the national perspective. And it is our duty to liberate the human sciences, or the social sciences, from the grip of the nationalist ideology and perspective. Though the human sciences have appeared parallel to the nation-state and to nationalism, and although over the past 2 decades the human sciences have indeed been at the service of nationalism, Beck refuses to see them as necessarily interlinked or as tainted, and therefore just to junk all the social sciences as kind of the fruits of the poisonous tree. His commitment to enlightenment drives him to advocate not the discard of science, but its radical reform, its liberation from the grips of nationalism through the cosmopolitan perspective. Such project would help to demystify the national elites that see themselves as living in a world controlled by nation-states, while this is simply not the case. Beck convincingly shows how the national methodology has become one of the most important building blocks of the national ideology. The most basic categories are indeed captive of the national order. Just think of family, gender, religion, poverty, preferences, etc. All of these are not merely defined by law, and it is always a national law, but they are also defined and operated by administrative agencies, again, national administrative agencies. So even if we think as scientists about family, we also think through some kind of a national perspective. It could also be an international perspective in the sense that you read comparative, but it is always through a national perspective, and national perspective always already embedded in a state apparatus that is operating with these disciplines. And this is the interlink, the close ties between the social sciences discipline and the nation state, and of nationalism, therefore. And the demystification of our sciences would require us to part with nationalism and to see the world as it is already cosmopolitan. And of course, it is an ongoing process, so it's already cosmopolitanized or cosmopolitanizing, but it's also, and here is the emphasis, it is also the ideal which is revealed through the demystification. And indeed, Beck claims, if we open our eyes, we can see that everything is already cosmopolitan. Disasters, environment, risks, terror, cities, Europe, and societies. They are all cosmopolitan. And this cosmopolitanness, however, is not universalism. It is really important. It is not universalism, and nor is it the horizon of universalism. It is the in-between, the cosmos and the polis. So cosmopolitanism is cosmos, the world, and polis, the city. It is the exact in-between, or this and that, as he calls it. The this and that, rather than the either-or. So it is rather than choosing between the local and the global, between the universal and the particular, between Europe and the nation state, it is this and that. And it is this and that which isn't just about the reality, but it also the this and that which for Beck demonstrates that our logic of either or is misguided. So again, here is the connection between what you see in reality and the theory with which you work. Once you see that in reality people can be both local and global, you understand that in theory these things are not in contradiction but actually can live together. Beck demonstrates how Europe, for example, is already cosmopolitan despite the denial and self-delusion of European elites who imagine that they still control their nations despite evidence that this is no longer true. Cities, again, especially global cities, are good examples of the reality of cosmopolitanism. They are part of the world, being nodal points for the dissemination of people, goods, capital, and images, but they are still part of their nations too. They exemplify the logic of this and that, of globalism and localism, of the transnational that cohabits with the national. But here comes my first critique. While he convinces us that this might indeed be the current reality, there is nothing in what he says that assures us that this project is unavoidable or necessary. Especially for a sociologist, of course, one would like to know who are and where are the agents. How has this reality come to being? What is it that is unavoidable in this idea? What is the result of pure scientific objective discoveries? Maybe, let's say, the unified nature of the ecology, which is just a scientific fact. And what is the result of ideological shifts that then themselves start to change the way we see reality? Who, in other words, were the agents and are the agents that advance this cosmopolitan reality and the processes that Beck uncovers? Obviously, at least some of these processes can be undone, and they can be reversible. And therefore, at some moments, there seems to be a suggestion that this is an unavoidable reality, an unavoidable unfolding, but then, again, in the lecture, we actually heard the reverse might also be true, because there are all these backlashes and reversals. And again, a lot of what Beck sees, therefore, as puzzling blindness of people to cosmopolitanism, I think are not puzzling blindnesses, but mere objections, willful, sometimes half-willful, for this reality that can, as I said, be undone.
How much time do I have?
I'm in debt already?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, so I will kind of be brief and won't be able to say everything that I wanted. Again, to emphasize the point of the this and that logic, because this is another very important component of the theory of cosmopolitanism, the insistence that what we think now as dichotomies that theoretically cannot live together and are by necessity conflictual in their interests, what Beck says is once we actually demystify ourselves and look at reality itself, then we actually see that this and that can work together, and that the logic of either or is irrelevant for our times, or is less and less relevant. But this problem, of course, but this idea, of course, and this is my second critique, brings the question of what is it, therefore, that enables us to pick and choose from reality that which we want to keep and that which is no longer desirable or normatively wanted. Because if the cosmopolitan reality is the critical theory, then it itself should provide us with the tools to distinguish between the desirable and the undesirable. And a lot of what Professor Beck says is actually so enthusiastic of the changes that we see, is that there is almost an embrace of all the changes that are happening, trying to kind of show all of them as markers of cosmopolitanism. But then what we're left with is, okay, so what is bad? And here I want to say that actually a lot, I think, of what is bad is classical class theory. That is, that a lot of it is kind of a retreat into classical poor and rich, and here again we are left with the national categories, or men and women, again, a category which previously was criticized as captive of the national order, and therefore I was at least, it was hard for me to actually see how would we distinguish between the things that should be celebrated in the cosmopolitan reality and what are the things that we should actually be scared of and say, no, we don't want that. Just one last comment. There is a lot to, I was struck by the similarities between Professor Beck and Karl Marx. And I hope Professor Beck will not take it as an insult. And of course there are various striking similarities. The writing style, perhaps one of the first things that one notices, which is a move between the wild, the journalistic, the ironic, the purely academic, the prosaic, and the immense, I would say, the beautiful prose with which Beck writes. I think, again, that also Beck poses himself as the critical sociologist, but of the second modernity, while Marx was of the first. Of course, I would say also, like the younger Marx, the materialism is not materialism, definitely not a deterministic one, but a more ideologically motivated materialism. And much like Marx, there is a desire to create a non-ideological science. And I think that this, again, maybe is my third problem. I am not sure how this can be done. I mean, what is it that allows us to actually see reality And we know that for Marx it was also a big problem. How can one see reality without the mystifying glasses or the lenses of bourgeois ideology? And I think, however, that this is the attempt. And one last comment again, but I think that here is the reversal, and talking about the German giving a talk. And I think that at least this German, unlike Marx, sees the Jew rather than as the epitome of the disease, right? For Marx, the Jew was almost the symbol of capitalism. For Beck, the Jew, the eternal cosmopolitan, is the symbol not of the disease, but of the cure and the critical theory of cosmopolitanism.
Thank you, Ishai, for your comments. Our next speaker is Dr. Nissim Mizrahi. Nissim is a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Tel Aviv University. He received his MA summa cum laude from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, his PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and he was a research fellow at Harvard University. He has received several prizes, including Fulbright, Rockefeller, Lady Davis Awards, and the 2008 Geertz Prize for that year's Best Article in Sociology of Culture, awarded by the American Sociological Association. Dr. Mizrahi's main areas of interest are the sociology of knowledge and culture, science and medicine, practice theory, and social inequality. He has published in a variety of venues, including the American Sociological Review, American Ethnologists, Social Science and Medicine, etc. So I'll only mention two of his current research projects. One is a 2010 co-edited volume together with Professor Michel Lamont from the Harvard University, a special issue on ethnic and racial studies, and local research that he's doing sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, where he's studying the social boundaries of identity, politics, their cultural roots and historical context, and a bottom-up analysis of the perception of social structure among different social groups.
Wow.
Yeah. I almost managed to memorize it all.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Shai. After reading the excellent introduction of Ishai Blanc, I felt that, I need to maybe take a different path and to do something else. I, of course, share the my impression of the cosmopolitan agenda advocated by Professor Ulrich Beck. It's a really rich, multi-layered text, both as a political manifest, but also as a moral philosophy. It represents an ambitious scientific program aimed at no less than revolutionizing contemporary theory and research in the social sciences as a whole. I endorse many of his ideas. The overall revolutionary tenor and the liberating voice. What I really want to do here is to take a closer look of kind of the way in which some of the assumptions or underlying assumptions of the normative dimension, Ulrich Beck's theory, and to take a closer look about what happened when they hit the ground and when they meet local worlds of meaning. So I would suggest that we shift our gaze now from the kind of the sweeping image of a fluid global world to the connection between the social and the moral. And as Durkheim reminds us, morality consists in solidarity. This is a quote. Cause all social life to vanish, and moral life would vanish at the same time, having no object to cling to. End quote. What I intend doing here is to focus on this inherent link between the moral and the social network of meaning, and what Arthur Kleinman is called the person's moral experience. in relation to some of the ideas of Professor Beck. And in the limited time I have, I would like to take a closer look at Beck's notion of human rights and social inequality in context. So I'm going to contextualize some of, the very concept by taking an example from our local state. It's kind of a state example. So I open with Lynn Hunt. Lynn Hunt, the noted historian of modern Western Europe, asks, how can human rights be universal if they are not universally recognized? Okay, so here I'm talking at the grammar, at the political grammar of the kind of this normative use of human rights, and also equality and inequality, but I think the time is not met. A query captures quite precisely the gap between the universal aspirations of the human rights message and the socially bounded profile of its messengers and its limited social outreach. In Israel, two of the most striking characteristics of human rights activism are the demographic homogeneity of activists, educated members of primarily Ashkenazi, Jews of European descent, middle class, and here's class, and the recurrent failure of the message to cross social boundaries, again, within the context of the state, and the recurrent failure of the message to cross social boundaries so as to reach traditionalist and marginalized group, kind of a target population. Based on some striking field evidence from my recent studies supported by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Israel, it appears, I would argue, that the human rights message and its messengers pose a serious threat to many of the movement's target population. The message itself. In Israel, this includes, but not limited to, the working class traditionalist Mizrahi population, Jews from Middle Eastern and Northern African countries. And this is kind of just a case that you might want to discuss. The work of the political philosopher Charles Taylor provides some hints regarding how to begin unraveling the social roots of this puzzling situation. In its seminal paper on the politics of recognition, Taylor argues that modern identity emerged during the fundamental shift from honor to dignity. With the move from honor to dignity has come the politics of universalism, emphasizing the equal dignity of all citizens, and the content of this politics has been the equalization of rights and entitlements. The politics, end quote. The politics of universalism born in the state and its creation of the status of the citizens has since been extended to the notion of a global humanity. In The Homeless Mind, sociologist Peter Berger and his co-authors note that, quote, the concept of honor implies that identity is essentially, or at least importantly, linked to institutional roles. The modern concept of dignity implies that identity is essentially independent of institutional roles. And here I'm talking kind of the relation between the local and the global. Taylor, like Bauman, Beth, and others, describe the modern self as autonomous and fluid, moving throughout the global space, disconnected from social hierarchies, roles, and institutions. We should note, however, that this process never penetrated the entire society. In fact, it kind of divides society along different lines, including class and ethnicity. This means that the rupture between the sources of identity and self-worth, between honor and dignity, continues to exist and may intensify in the multicultural nation states. Without repeating the well-known communitarian literature, the point I'm stressing here is that despite the global risks pervading the modernity, numerous local communities perceive the universal discourse of human rights as more threatening than any benefit social justice can offer. To give one example for what appears to be the majority of working class Mizrahi in Israel, local hierarchies and the collective category of Jewishness matter far more than any idea of global human rights. The human rights discourse, because it subordinates their local moral system to universal code, poses an existential threat to some people, because it undermines their sense of belonging and solidarity, feelings embedded in local structures and a world of meaning. I want to make clear that I'm fully aware of the trap of essentialism, lacking in any portrayal of social divide like that, and fully aware of kind of the fluidity. However, I see the challenge to sociologists is the avoidance of the verification of such divisions. At the same time, our mission is to identify the local conditions under which crossing the boundaries, this fluidity, between worlds of meaning becomes possible or not. The analysis touches upon the social roots of current controversies in Israeli society. Consider the heated debates that are related to some of the examples that Professor Bex gave before about the deportation of the children of labor migrants. Why does the liberal Israeli elite defend the human rights of these children, while most of traditionalist working class Israelis argue for their deportation? In this case, the Mizrahi traditionalist working class population, Jewishness is their only and the most valuable cultural resource. Their identity as Jews is the only capital allowing them to claim a superior position in Israeli multi-ethnic social hierarchy. From their perspective, equating the human rights of African children with their own human rights devalues their sole cultural currency. So I'm just looking, I don't have time to give like empirical examples here, but I just want to emphasize that the message of human rights can really, that there was some kind of underlying assumption or tone that it's that we're talking about kind of a liberating message in itself. We just need the proper condition for the message to penetrate. But the message itself was born in a particular context and needs to be contextualized. One can witness the same tension in the recurrent conflict over migrant workers, gay rights, and the peace movement. The structure of peace and human rights demonstrations in Israel gives visible expression to the point I'm trying to make. It betrays signs of the anthropological notion of a carnival, with participants switching roles and identities. The majority of demonstrators rebelling against the state are often children of its founding Ashkenazi elite. They are mostly professionals and academics. Ironically, the police and the security forces representing the state belonging to Israel's minority groups, they are mostly Mizrahi Ethiopians and Druze, border guard officers. As the demonstration continues, the Israeli passerby and taxi drivers emerging from their cabs frequently vent their rage at the demonstrations. At this particular moment of contact between the two groups and the two worlds of meaning, level of verbal violence reaches rhetorical peaks. Such moments draws out of forbidden language on the most personal level. People appear like whipping others with words as if protecting their own lives. This same movement allow the police officers to the same moment to dramatize their control. For 2 hours, they are the state. So the rebellious demonstrators return to managing the state, and the police officer returns to their patrols. Ethno-class divisions are again submerged within daily routines. So I was hesitant about the clip that I'm going to show because it's not easy to watch. But it's 3 minutes of a very, very kind of a difficult scene, but I'll show it anyway because it really captures kind of the social energy, really the high social energy that this kind of event provokes. So. Okay, we're watching a peace demonstration in Jerusalem. That was a kind of film, a peace demonstration held in Jerusalem, and I think it's a familiar scene that we see, kind of the rage and in a way, it is about kind of this encounter between worlds of meaning more than anything else. I would say. They showed this kind of in a way, the status Jew that you took as the exemplar of the cosmopolitan in Europe, to describe it, but it continues to be kind of the object of violence in her own land. This problem may be viewed as a malady generated by the nation state, but what is the source of the malady? Nationalism or the cosmopolitan stand? I'm not sure. The only meaning of global human rights for the furious opponents to demonstrators is betrayal, a transgression against the sacredness of the state. While it would be almost inconceivable to use the methodological empathy with the opponent, the cosmopolitan project, when it touches the ground, is morally and politically obliged to consider what is most at stake, it's quote, for actors in the local social world. What really matters and what is threatened, end quotes. This is Kleiman's word. Okay? So, okay. So, so in a way, I maybe end by saying that when I think about the normative level of the cosmopolitan vision, I think we should be very cautious about the way how fast or how quick we celebrate the kind of the march towards cosmopolitization. And I think that we need, I think, a more nuanced analysis, to really read the exact meaning of cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitization, when the precise meaning of cosmopolitization should be carefully studied on the ground. And I think that this is, in a way, kind of a moral imperative in this dangerous state of nationalism. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nissim Mizrahi. Our third speaker is Dr. Hila Shamir, a lecturer here at the law faculty. Hila received her BA degree, LLB degree here from Tel Aviv University, then went to Harvard for her LLM and SJD degree. She clerked for the Justice Matzah at the Israeli Supreme Court. She returned here just 2 years ago, although it seems like it's been forever. She teaches employment law, labor law, welfare law. She received in 2009 the European Union's Marie Curie Reintegration Research Grant and the prestigious Alon Fellowship from the Council of Higher Education in Israel. In her dissertation, Hila studied the distribution and markets of care, which is, I think, something that she will also be talking about today, comparing the distributive effects of the law of employment, welfare, and immigration in the United States, Australia, and Israel. So we have the national, international comparative framework. Hillel's research continues to focus on the interaction of the institutions of the market, the family, and the state as they affect the distribution of material and symbolic power. Please.
So thank you very much, Shai and Joseph, for organizing this, and thank you, Professor Beck, for coming. It's not obvious these days, so thank you for having this dialogue with us and having the opportunity to... Can you hear me okay? Okay. And having this opportunity to discuss cosmopolitization, which seems more relevant than ever these days with the horrific events in Japan and the revolutions in the Arab world. So in my comment today, I want to react to the third chapter of the upcoming book, which is titled Living in a Global Rich Society, and to some aspects of your lecture today. My reaction will be first and foremost as a legal scholar, thinking about how the concept of cosmopolitanism, a la Beck, can be relevant to the study of law. Cosmopolitization, as Beck defines it, is the enmeshment with the global other, a concept that is possibly an ideal, but also already everywhere around us. It is universalism that maintains an element of the particular and globalism that retains the national. The immense usefulness of this concept, I believe, lies in the fact that it includes the ambivalence of the local and the global in their simultaneous existence, and it refrains from being nostalgic, and instead calls us for a realist outlook and for institutional innovation. Beck challenges us to learn to see, describe, and exploit the transformative potential of the global risk society in which we live. Cosmopolitanism is therefore a methodology, as well as a normative and critical theory. I will engage with Beck's theory today on these three grounds, as a methodology, as a normative theory, and as a critical theory. And again, from my perspective as a legal scholar. And mostly I will insist on some important aspects of the national, even within a cosmopolitan point of view. So in this sense, I'm going to be a methodological nationalist of sorts. By this, but I want to say from the start that I'm not opposing or denying the structural transformations that occur all around us, and do challenge the nation state, what Beck calls cosmopolitization. Rather, I argue that cosmopolitanism is a necessary yet insufficient theory on all three levels, both as a methodology, as a normative, and a critical theory. So I will begin with what I find easiest to fully accept in Beck's theory, which is cosmopolitanism as a normative position. So what does cosmopolitanism entail as a normative position? In discussing the global risk society, Beck points out the transformative potential of shared risk. Shared risks force on us global cooperation and lead to, among other things, the creation of alternative governance structures. Indeed, as Beck suggests, the global risk society, with its shared risks of terrorism, economic crisis, epidemics, nuclear weapons, and climate change, shows us that one state could not deal with these challenges on its own, and that global cooperation, and thus global governance, is required. I think here Beck's cosmopolitization theory offers us lawyers a significant contribution. It enables us to see that global governance is the solution we still do not have. It urges us to envision strengthened mechanisms of global governance that have an improved public policy capacity to resolve conflicts, manage risks, and address common problems. At the same time, cosmopolitization is not merely a rosy normative theory. It really does have a dark side. It makes us see that while we think about new global governance, in fact, our world is already governed. Global occurrences that enhance our vulnerability, economic instability, warfare, environmental degradation, are not problems that escape governance, but are rather the byproducts, or some may claim even the intended consequences, of our current arrangement of governance. This does not mean that we have a governance structure that we understand. It doesn't mean that we currently have a good picture of how our world is in fact governed. But in this sense, cosmopolitanism sets what I understand to be the following normative agenda. We need to discover current governance structures and work for their improvement. So the normative path of cosmopolitization requires us to ask, where does power lie in the second modernity? Or in other words, who do we need to address if we want to protest poverty or simply participate in combating global inequality? As my comment today will soon show, the next step of it, I don't necessarily agree with all the answers that Professor Beck offers these questions. I believe the nation state is an important agent of governance, even in the cosmopolitanized setting. Yet I think that Professor Beck's cosmopolitanism makes us ask the exact right questions. Once we understand where power lies and how it shifts and moves around, the cosmopolitan moment and perspective will enable to exploit current global dynamics to bring about change, rupture, and transformation. Although, as I will shortly point out, I think cosmopolitanism cannot do this on its own. So while cosmopolitanism sets a normative agenda that I find extremely appealing and productive, I have trouble accepting some of its analytical implications, and especially its dismissal of the relevance of the national outlook. To this I turn now, moving to cosmopolitanism as a methodology and a critical theory. So I begin with cosmopolitanism as a methodology. Cosmopolitanism, Professor Beck suggests, is a methodology that allows us to discern our actual political reality. Its other is methodological nationalism, which analyzes society on the assumption that it is a nationally structured phenomenon. In law, we mostly study the products of the institutions of national and international governance, laws, regulations, treaties, directives, court opinions, etc. It therefore might seem that almost by definition, we are under the spell of methodological nation-statism, if not methodological nationalism. In many ways, lawyers are trapped in the concept of the first modernity. What do we study? We study zombie institutions like the Constitution, the welfare state, labor unions, focusing on power arenas like parliaments and courts, institutions that were long vacated of their full power, that by now has moved either to the international and the global, or to the private sphere of the market and civil society. Yet because the study of law focuses on governance institutions, their products and interactions, I think legal scholars are also at the intellectual front line of the study of cosmopolitization at work. And if we look at what legal scholars do today, a lot of it is just that. The increasing involvement of civil society actors in legislation and policy formulation processes, growing practices of public participation and deliberative democracy in all levels of governance, the growing involvement of market actors in the provision of public services, and the challenges of regulations that result, the increasing influence of global and international regimes on the local and the national, used both by those in power, military and capital, and by those seeking social change, human rights organizations. So from the lawyer's standpoint, therefore, the transformation brought about by shared global risks is well underway. And the cosmopolitan moment is indeed a political and social reality. And yet, from our view, or at least from my view, in this front seat of institutional transformation, the changing role of the state, though not its disappearance, is evident. Corporations are becoming more dominant, and so are civil society and international bodies, but their changing roles do not always entail the retrenchment of the nation-state or the disappearance of national power. Rather, it shows its institutional transformation. A position that dismisses or even just underestimates the continuing role of the state represents an excessively reified idea of the state, as if the state can take one form. It imagines a single institutional configuration that is the state and proceeds to evaluate deviations from it to imply that we are now beyond the state. But what is this coherent state from which we are now losing power? Did it ever exist in one form? Claims for governance without the state do not only reify the state, but also represent a reification of the private-public distinction, a distinction that has long been subjected to what I considered compelling, if not devastating, critiques. Was the state ever a coherent source of power? Was there a time in which we could easily say where the public ends and the private begins? The state we need to imagine for the cosmopolitan critique of methodological nationalism is itself, I would argue, a mere conceptual placeholder that never existed in one clear form, and that never established the clear line between the public and the private that is now being allegedly muddied by the second modernity. The second modernity, with its new forms of governance, is not about the absence of governmental agent. The state is intertwined and entangled in all of our public and private relationships. What is needed for re-theorizing governmentality and the state is a methodology that is not a justification for the state's diminishing power, but rather one that reveals its new forms of power. I believe that the cosmopolitan perspective is exceptionally conductive for this kind of analysis. But it has to come in addition to, and not instead of, the nationalist one. So in order to take this path, a third-order question needs to be asked. And here I'm referring to the two orders that Beck refers to in other writings, the what and the who. So I'm going to put that aside because we didn't talk about it today. But what I want to say, that what is missing in a lot of the cosmopolitan Beck's cosmopolitan literature is a question about, not about what, which Beck sees as the question of first modernity, and not about who, which is the question of the second modernity, but about how. How is social inequality brought about? How do various governmental mechanisms sustain and legitimate it? Without the question, an important piece of the puzzle is missing in the story of cosmopolitization. And this piece, I believe, has to do with the role of the state. And I'll expand with one example, using the global care chains example that Professor Beck just used in his talk today. In discussing the phenomenon of, just to remind, the global care chains, we're talking about the migration of care workers from the global south to the global north that cosmopolitanizes and deeply transforms families in sending and receiving countries. So this is what we're talking about. And in talking about it today, Professor Beck, you said something like that we can neither analyze nor understand, or maybe not even see, this process, this global transformation that is internal to family life without from the national point of view. So the national point of view hides it from us. And I would like to argue exactly the opposite is true. I think that one cannot fully understand the story of care worker migration from a merely cosmopolitan perspective. In order to fully understand the global care chains, we need to ask the third question of how those migratory processes and familial transformations occur. And I will briefly use the Israeli case as an example for the crucial role of the nation state in global care chain, and explaining how they are brought about and how their outcomes are legitimated. So since the early 1990s, tens of thousands of migrant care workers come to Israel legally on guest worker visas. They take care of our dependent individuals, elderly and disabled. Guest worker visas are granted to workers from countries that are signatories to agreements with Israel. So the main country of origins in the care work sector are the Philippines, Nepal, India, and Eastern European states like Moldova. There are currently approximately 40,000 documented migrant care workers in Israel. So the Israeli case, on the one hand, is another manifestation of the global care chain phenomenon and the intense cosmopolitization of middle-class families. And in the Israeli case, actually, families of almost all classes because of the welfare state. Yet the entrance of migrant workers into Israeli families and the conditions in which they enter Israel are heavily determined by first modernity categories of the nation state and of the welfare state, and cannot be understood without them. So labor migration was introduced in Israel in 1993 following the outbreak of the First Intifada. And the Oslo Accord, Palestinians were no longer permitted to enter Israel for work purposes due to what was justified as security reasons. The sealing of the occupied territories led to labor shortage in Israeli secondary labor markets, especially in the fields of agriculture and construction. So in order to deal with this labor shortage, the Israeli government established a guest worker visa program, all national. Maybe not. So permission to employ a migrant worker today is limited to certain industries, mostly those that I mentioned before, construction, agriculture, also restaurants, but now also care work. While the demand for workers in construction and agriculture was the direct result of the sealing of the occupied territories, the same was not true concerning care work. Palestinians were not previously employed as in-home health aides, and in fact there was not a thriving market for live-in care workers at all. The guest worker regime was developed in tandem with developments in the Israeli welfare state. So beginning in 1988, Israel started offering a long-term care benefit, Gimlat Siud, for elderly citizens requiring assistance in everyday activities. So those who are eligible for the benefit can also apply to the relevant governmental agency for a permit to employ migrant workers as in-home care aides. The long-term care benefit was introduced in Israel in times of welfare state retrenchment and budgetary cuts. So wanting to cut down the size of public service, a decision was made that the state will not directly employ care workers. Rather, in the liberal tradition of a service-passive state, the state pays a private care-providing agency to provide the applicant with in-home care services. Therefore, the state neither pays nor employs the migrant workers. It's all done through market contracting. The provision of long-term care was structured to ensure that the state distance itself from the position of an employer or a direct provider of care. This arrangement created a market that didn't exist in Israel before. It created a market of care-providing agencies, which didn't exist, and by opening this path and supplying cheap labor, and subsidized labor because of the benefit, it also created a specific new need in families for 24 hours live-in care. And the numbers are astounding. Today, a recent study suggests that if the current rate goes on, by 2025, every fifth elderly person in Israel will be aided by a migrant care worker. The working conditions of these migrant care workers are also heavily dependent on the state. And I won't go into this now in depth, but there's a no-family policy, which means they cannot bring their family, they cannot marry, they cannot have children. If they have children, they have to leave the country and have the child stay in the country of origin, and then they can come back. There's a no-family policy. There used to be a binding policy. So their living situation, their market power, even their wages are actually determined by the state, but again, the state is removed. Now, this high level of exclusion is well known in other countries as well, but it has an Israeli Jewish aspect to it as well, because having these workers come in seemingly contradicts the basic principle of the Israeli immigration regime, which is a Jewish immigration regime. Mostly. It gives primacy to ethno-national criteria in attributing full membership in the polity. So the contradiction, I need to end?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, good. So the contradiction is softened by these restrictive, no family, binding policies noted above. So in this sense, the various restrictive policies reflect a very local and a very nation-centric view of the globalized care market. Israel, at least formally, refuses to fully succumb to the power of the globalized market. Whether it succeeds or not is the cosmopolitan question. I think it's the state's decisions about welfare provision, immigration regime, labor and employment law that restructures the experience of migrant care workers in Israel. Therefore, while it is part of the cosmopolitan moment, it is also part of new forms of nation-state governance and new public-private interactions. I think this case study shows that the cosmopolitan perspective can hardly engage with the full scope of mechanisms that cause, legitimate this inequality that is produced by the migration of care workers. And this was only the Israeli side. Of course, there is a whole other side in the sending countries. Cosmopolitanism as a methodology to view our political reality reveals important aspects of our reality, but may be blinding us to persistent realities of state power, even if in new forms. So I don't really have time. I had another piece which is about the critical perspective, so I'll just say it really briefly. And in the critical perspective, I wanted to give the example of a new union that joined union. This is a classic zombie institution, right? What do unions mean today? But maybe they do. So a union actually started organizing migrant workers in Israel and actually started giving them the path for political participation, not through voting, but through union membership. So we have here a labor union that is reinventing itself and stretching the idea of what the union is, what the state is, what solidarity is. It has to face all these different hurdles. Who is the employer? How do we bring together workers from different countries in solidarity to fight in Israel for their rights? But still, I think this union couldn't have gotten there, couldn't have started organizing workers in a political process of participation if it wasn't working within the nation state, in a sense. So I therefore think that also critically, if we want to change what we see around us, which I do think is the normative call of cosmopolitanism, we still really do need nation-state categories to think about them. So I'll end with this.
Thank you.
So our last and by far not our least speaker for this panel is Professor Natan Schneider for us, Nusi. He is a professor of sociology at the Academic College of Tel Aviv, Yafo. He writes about cosmopolitanism, of course, about globalization and memory. His latest book, co-authored with Daniel Levy, deals with the impact of the memory on the human rights regime. It's called Human Rights and Memory at the University of Penn State Press. And soon enough, forthcoming is his book on Jewish memory and the cosmopolitan order, to be published later this year with Polity. And above to everything else, Professor Natan Schneider has published together with Professor Ulrich Beck and works together with Professor Ulrich Beck. Therefore, it is our special pleasure to have him speak with us tonight.
Okay. Thank you so much, and I hope I can keep your attention, since being the last speaker in such a long day is not very easy. So my view will be a view from the inside, but it will also be a view from the outside. And what I want to do is try to connect in 10 minutes the 18th century with the 21st century. Not more, no less, yes. The 18th century, as you know, was the age of modern cosmopolitanism, better known as the Enlightenment. This is where Ulrich Beck starts. This is his point of departure, but it goes far beyond that. Historically, there are many things we can learn from this period, especially the way one looks and understands others. Just look at the fabulous book by Montesquieu on the Persian letters. Sociology, on the other hand, is the typical science of the 19th century. It developed together with the nation-state. And as you know, the classics of sociology are so thoroughly pervaded by now with a spatially fixed understanding of culture and society that it is hardly remarked upon. It is a conception that goes back to sociology's birth amidst the 19th century formation of nation-states. The territorial conception of culture and society, the idea of culture as rooted and limited, constituted through the opposition of the we and them, was itself a reaction to the enormous changes that were going on as that century turned into the 20th. It was a conscious attempt to provide a solution to the uprooting of local cultures that the formation of nation-states necessarily involved. Sociology understood the new symbols and common values, above all, as means of integration into a new unity. The triumph of this national imagination can be seen in the way the nation-state has ceased to appear as a project and a construct and has become instead widely regarded as something natural and the opposition of national-international, the internalized compass of the social sciences. A cosmopolitan sociology, as Beck suggests, and you can see this quite clearly laid out in the 4 essays which are in the book, is posing a challenge to this idea that binding history and borders tightly together is the only possible means of social and symbolic integration. Thus, Ulrich Beck wants nothing more than to reconnect sociology to the 18th century and the project of the Enlightenment. No easy task if you think of the reputation of the Enlightenment has today. In his books and articles, and we do have now a good example of his work in the 4 essays of the Hebrew translation, Ulrich Beck insists that cosmopolitanization does not operate somewhere in the abstract, in the external macrosphere, somewhere above human heads, but is internal to the everyday life of people, to people's action. And this might be maybe the only point that I might look at critically at your otherwise really beautiful introduction. Most of sociology still applying the rules of methodological nationalism, treating societies confined in the borders of nation states as natural units of data collections and analysis, as Ulrich Beck has pointed out before in his lecture. But this is a blind avenue. Maybe not a blind avenue, but a one-eyed avenue, and doesn't leave open another gaze. Beck starts from the point of view that the universal and particular exist in a dialectical relation, that every particularization is a particularization of a universal, and that every universal is a universalization of a particular. They do not oppose each other. They define and influence each other. This is a very crucial point in the cosmopolitan enterprise. In methodological cosmopolitanism, the universal means what it does because the particular are its background, and where the particulars mean what they do because the universal is their background. As a result, when one changes, the other changes, but importantly, neither disappears. And of course, the nation-state does not disappear in that cosmopolitan project. Universalism and particularism need to be thought out together. This means that the strength of global culture does not entail the weakness of national culture. On the contrary, the strength of national culture is exactly what produces cosmopolitan culture. The mutual influence of nations through the institutions of globalization produces both sides of cosmopolitanization, the central but growing core of common values, and the globalized inflections of local meaning. For example, one of the leading modern cosmopolitan ideas today, and as we have heard in the lecture also, is expressed in the concept of human rights. The text most people think of as the founding text of modern human rights campaigning is Kant's On Perpetual Peace. But Kant's idea was that a stable and peaceful political order could be constructed only out of nation states that made mutually supportive vows of non-intervention. This view was embodied to a large degree in the League of Nations and in the original UN Charter, and can be considered in many ways to be the beginning of the idea of modern international law, something all cosmopolitans think of as a good thing. But there's no escaping that Kant's project regards the sovereignty of nation states as sacrosanct. It is not an added-on opinion. It is a central principle on which the entire structure stands. And this is precisely the view that human rights campaigning has set itself against in the post-Cold War world. Modern cosmopolitan politics begins with the principle that sovereignty is not the highest principle and is not sacrosanct. Rather, the highest principle is human well-being and the duty to prevent suffering wherever it occurs, to not stand by and allow innocent people to be slaughtered. The brief dream of a world society that flourished in the Enlightenment was almost completely crushed by the nationalism to which it simultaneously gave birth, and Enlightenment sensibilities were completely ineffectual in, of course, diminishing war. Yet it was the experience of nationalism in its most extreme form that gave human rights its potential to flourish. Therefore, not abstract rational thought and how the world has to work alone, but human experience, the experience of catastrophe, which at the same time is the experience of a world where human rights do not exist, is the basis for new human rights regimes. But looking at cosmopolitanism this way, you may think that this is hopelessly optimistic. And you may ask, what about power? What about interest? And you may ask this rightly so, since, as you know, we sociologists are not supposed to think in terms of optimism, especially when the world around is falling out of sync. But even though optimism might be intellectually more challenging than doomsday sociology, it is exactly, Beck doesn't go down that road. He's really not that optimist that a lot of people suppose him to be. And it is exactly at that point where Beck's theory of cosmopolitanism encounters his theory of risk and world risk society. Beck's theory of risk society, and you can see this in this wonderful chapter on world risk society in this new book, quite clearly shows that humans as temporal beings lack the continuity, the extension into the future of what they take to be good. Beck's sociology is, of course, also sociology of religion, and it's no coincidence that his latest book deals with God. And this view shares some devotion to the atemporal origin. It transcends the dichotomy between past and future. And this is exactly what his theory of risk does. It enables to transcend the simple dichotomy between the conservative, preserving the past, and revolutionary, preparing for the future. Here we have a sociology which is at once conservative and revolutionary, neither wholly one nor the other. Back then to the future and risk. And if we would know the future, of course, there would be no notion of risk and there would be no notion of hope. And hope is precisely what you need when you don't know what the future will be. And if you know the future, there's no need for hope. And this is why the future is unknowable in risk society, because it will have different categories of reality and different categories of thought to go with them. We won't be able to understand how it works until we or our children will get there. It will emerge out of the present like a gestalt that is more than the sum of its parts. But until it does, and it really never does for us, we are always facing a future beyond us. We, living in the transition between the present and the future, will continuously keep guessing what will best capture the future that might possibly be. And this brings us again back to Beck's cosmopolitanism of world risk society. And the question remains, if it is connected to a sociology of religion, if there's room for redemption in his thought. Many have seen Beck's work as utopian in the classic sense, not the usual scientific lamentations, but a renewed effort to write the Book of Lamentations as a book where hope is always on the horizon. And in this sense, he's part of a fellowship of utopian and cosmopolitan thinkers of the last centuries. His work produces hope for those who need it most and tries to save globalization from those who see it as an inevitable process of history determined by some obscure laws. Again, you're not supposed to think like that as a sociologist. Most social scientists have become masters of avoidance of the dilemmas of modernity. On the one hand, many of us feel attracted to universalism, secularism, scientism, you name it. On the other hand, we feel actually too sophisticated to buy into these promises. So we have become critical. And what does that actually mean? It's not clear at all than turning into relativist or celebrating the beauty or ugliness of particularism is certainly an option or not an option. And I think that Nissim Mizrahi, willingly or not, has given us a wonderful example about the ugliness of particularism. Thus, we need to be careful. Otherwise, there's another mega trap lurking around the corner. I mean that even the most radical criticism of society and culture has the potential to turn into caricatures of the catastrophic potential of developed modernity. And you just have to turn on the news. You don't really need anymore the most radical criticism of society. Maybe there's an opening now to take another step before our criticism turns antiquated and almost idyllic. It means that it is increasingly difficult to develop horizons of experience. Again, we social scientists, we don't like that too much. We are used to think in structures, but structure means that there exists a relative duration, no structure without time. But with increased acceleration, there may be neither duration nor structure. Thus, this is the reason why it is important to go back to the 18th century. Ulrich Beck writes, I think, in the tradition of the great 18th century cosmopolitan Immanuel Kant, both ask their readers to expand their knowledge boundaries. In Kant's critique of judgment, a kind of precursor to Beck's critical theory of cosmopolitanism, he demands, and Beck demands, enlarged thought, enlarged thinking, which means nothing more than broader and wider open-minded thinking as the condition for cosmopolitanism. What does that mean? It sounds simple enough. It means disregard for the subjective private conditions of our own judgment without giving up judgment entirely. I think this is also a remark pointed to your paper. Quite the opposite is true, however. The cosmopolitan condition, as Beck so successfully, in my opinion, demonstrates in these essays, requires us to take on another's viewpoint without giving up ours. Judging involves our horizons of knowledge. Without these, we cannot judge. Our thinking is encompassed in the plurality of meanings, not West or non-West, not Ashkenazi or Mizrahi, but both. You absorb within yourself the viewpoints of others as well as your own, and by this create a common world out of difference. This is the problem of cosmopolitanism. You don't become the other. You remain what you are, but you have the imagination to understand what that kind of feeling of being might be for others through their words and thoughts. Thus we have left Kant's world of eternal peace behind and have gone beyond it to Beck's world of eternal risk and negotiation. Thus, in the end, Beck's projects wants to reconnect to the 18th century, to jump over the nation-state-bound conception of society, to go beyond the professional sociological boundaries, originally set when the Enlightenment had been rejected by the sociological enterprise. Sociology has finally come home to its own roots. Thank you.
So, first of all, thank you for 4 great presentations. We started a bit late. We were supposed to end practically now, but we started a bit late. So I think we have some time. I think Professor Beck may want to respond. We'd like to invite him to sit here if he wishes. So, please. And then I think for the benefit of the audience, I don't think that we're going to take questions unless there is something very pressing to be asked. But if not, then we will offer Professor Beck the last word.
Well, it has been overwhelming, I have to say. So many arguments and so sophisticated reactions. It's impossible to just give an adequate answer or reaction to this. First of all, I would give an excuse saying, well, I'm not going to answer the questions, but the book is going to answer the questions. So you should have a look at the book. But second, I think there are some elements which are maybe common to some extent between the different speakers. All of them very, very sophisticated, very challenging. But it reminded me, and I maybe pick up this issue, which to some extent seems to be the leading issue with all, at least the 3 commentators. What does methodological cosmopolitanism mean? I just edited a special issue in British Journal of Sociology. This issue is about varieties of second modernity. And the main narrative of this issue is that we cannot develop an idea from the European point of view, just say this is the way the world has to be understood, but we have to take the position and the contextual evidence of different contexts and nations into consideration. We did this in relation to Asia, to Asian countries, China, South Korea, and Japan. If you have a look at it, I think it's quite interesting. One of the outcomes of this discussion was that there are different sequences of pre-modernity, first modernity, and second modernity, different mixtures of those models. And to some extent, well, I don't want to go into detail about Asia. We got enough with the problem just relating to the Israeli context. But somebody said, I think it was you, that I have the Jew as an important figure of cosmopolitanism. And I think you are quite right. It's an important background. But there has to be some additional remark to this. I would say in relation to the Jews and to Israel, we have a different sequence of modernity first, and a traditional modernity. Maybe the Jews started with the second modernity, maybe even the third modernity, being cosmopolitanized through the world and reflecting those kind of identities. And now they are, let's say, back or forward to the first modernity. And suddenly you discover how important the state is. The state is actually doing a lot of things very importantly, and so you keep pushing this point. And I think it is, in the context here, I think it's quite evident in many aspects. We would have quite a lot of controversies in the details because you have to take this transnationalization into account as well. But I would say in relation, for example, to Europe, we have a different case of statehood as well, because even if we say we still have the different nation states, those nation states are Europeanized, even if they don't want to notice it. They are very much Europeanized. They are interdependent. They have all kind of mixtures in law, even in economy, as you know. So actually, we have here the case, and maybe we have to, of course, the nation states are very important. You know, the Germans just discovered it in relation to Europe. Suddenly the idea of a German Europe is all over again, and not even controversial in the German context. Only the other Europeans are getting a little bit frightened about the new self-consciousness of the German European idea. But still, you know, we have different types of... We could talk about nation states, but those nation states are to some extent transnational nations. They're not... I wouldn't use... Well, maybe this would be a discussion. Of course the state is important. Of course it's transformed. It would be complete misunderstanding to say the state disappears. I didn't want to say it. Maybe I said it, but I didn't want to say it. It's just the transformation of state. But first of all, the state is not the focus anymore, I would say. There are many other actors. Transnational capital, global capital, movements. You know, even if you have a war nation-state war or something in Israel, you have to refer to the global public. And if you don't do it, you may even have a victory, but on the global, on the cosmopolitanized issue of the global public, you are part of a different game. And this has a lot of reaction to the nation-state again. So there's a cosmopolitization going on even in Israel. Even if you have a national war, you have to refer to all kind of actors and have to connect and I don't know what. So there's some kind of interesting transnationalization if you want to be effective. So you have to change, have to adopt. This could be an ideology, could be reality, I don't know, all kind of mixtures. So it is, I would say, you need a different, even to understand Israel or the state or the importance of the Israel state, you cannot just concentrate on the Israeli state. You have to see all the different actors and relate to those, have to have a different focus. This is what I mean. To understand the transformation of nation states, you need a cosmopolitan perspective, again. So this is actually well, there's so many questions, and I think all of us are a little bit tired. It was fantastic. It was just fantastic, and I never experienced something like this before. Yes. Especially not in Germany. Especially not in Germany. They're not as much interested in this kind of cosmopolitization. That's an interesting background. You mentioned Kant, but the German, I wouldn't say the German mind, because this would be essentialistic and everything controversial in my own thinking. But still, we do have a mixture in our tradition, a mixture of universalism and unrecognized nationalism, methodological nationalism, a combination of both. We are generalizing from one society to this society, one experience to this society. I did it myself. I know what, this society to some extent is a German experience, universalized, and sometimes it fits, but it doesn't. But this doesn't work anymore. Of course you can do it, but it doesn't work anymore. And I wouldn't say that cosmopolitization and cosmopolitan methodology is a new God's view from nowhere. It's a new way of looking for the real reality, beyond methodology. It's not a new scientific vision where everybody, now finally we know what's going on. To some extent, I think was part of your question. But I think we even have to realize that we are part of a contextual experience. Like you are here, we are in Europe, and we are interconnected in many ways. And still, of course, we could to some extent universalize, but we have to get into a discussion and dialogue to find out how much the universalisms of I don't know, from the Israeli point of view or from the European point of view, really work. And this is what I mean by methodological cosmopolitanism. We have to find a method to do sociology or social science in general, not only looking at the national point of view or trying to defend it or, I don't know, or trying to emphasize how important the local still is. In this direction, this is an attack of the local to some extent. I would agree in this context. And in many other contexts as well. But we have to find a method which is not only concentrating on this or that, which tries to open up and connect those perspectives. And what I learned, for example, from this experience of varieties of second modernity, that I myself not only have to take in the very interesting different experiences of the Asian countries, which do have a different speed of development and different relation to risk and things like that, but that I have to change my own universalism of individualization theory, of risk theory, because it is connected to Europe. And maybe it's all right to see it in a European context, but I have to change this myself. And I think this is actually what should happen and should be part of the methodology of the social science.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let me just conclude with a sentence to return the compliment that this was also for us an extraordinary experience. Thank you very much for your visit here. Thank you very much for the talk. And again, thank you to the speakers. For many happy returns.